Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined with Kyle Dupick, and today we have on Tanner Pruitt.
Tanner, you had a tweet several weeks ago. You and I exchanged some texts about it. Just like a fascinating concept, not just looking at the common velocity command thing, but really like trying to ask, would you rather recruit a highly skilled pitcher and develop velocity, or maybe the other way? Would you rather recruit a hard thrower and develop skill, and kind of the nuance within that you and I were going back and forth on? Would you like just talk to us quickly about that tweet, what you were thinking, and get us started in that way?
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this tweet was back in August, so a little over a month now. So I don't know if I remember exactly the headspace I was in, but it was just, I'm looking at, the kids that we train at MASH and the high school kids, and then like things that they're chasing and things that they're getting told by college coaches. And it's like, oh, you need to hit this number and we'll recruit you. And it's like, well, that's great. Like, yes, we're going to train, we're going to do all those things, but like this kid gets out at a level that is higher than what he's being recruited for. Like, he shouldn't have to be required to hit a certain number and then he could be recruited by certain schools. It's like we got guys that are getting outs all the time at 82 to 85, and yet they're getting guys out that are committed to mid majors and other Division Ones. And it's like they're consistently getting those guys out. I'm sure that their skill would scale. And if you have the right coaches and the right strength staff in place, it would make sense that if you actually prioritized developing of the overall skill, which includes velocity, in the fall, then by the springtime, you should have that 82 to 85 guy at least having his floor up to 84. In my opinion, like raising the floor 2 miles an hour in the fall. I mean, that seems reasonable to me, especially if you're getting a high school kid, or fresh out of high school as a true freshman. I think that it's just a lot of college coaches, and I know you too, and I know you're not looking at it as black or white. There's a lot of nuance to it. But I think that even with all of the resources out there, it's like coaches are like, man, you have to hit this number and we'll give you an offer, like that type of thing. And it's just kind of ridiculous to me when you say you want outgetters and velocity doesn't matter, but then you straight up tell the kid, hey, you need to hit this number. Regardless of how they do, they're like, yeah, once you hit this number in a bullpen, we'll talk to you. It's like, why do you want it in a bullpen? Like, this doesn't make sense to me. So that's kind of what I remember this thread, or this short thread, like coming from. And it's like, I had this thought as I was getting ready for this yesterday, is like, if we had more skill coaches, so like pitching coaches or hitting coaches that were well versed in the S&C world, we could do a lot. Like, we could be pretty dangerous, right? Because a lot of the strength coaches, they have how many teams that they're in charge of? You know what I mean? It's like one coach for 30 teams, right? When I was a pitching coach at a Division II, and I was like, hey, can I take over the baseball strength side? And I was only there for the spring, but the strength coach was like, yes, please take it. I've got 30 plus other teams that I got to worry about. So, all right, cool. It's just like, how much more dangerous could we be if more skill coaches were versed in the S&C world and could actually put together a program that could work on everything and not just be one or the other?
Let me start with devil's advocate, just because I think the one thing that I would track so well with everything you would say, the one, maybe it's an old part of me, maybe it's just my experiences. Sometimes the thing that I personally fight with is like this normative growth of velocity that most people have. We have guys who make big jumps. You have guys who have your normative jumps. They just kind of slowly climb. And you have guys just who throughout the career, and this has been high school for me. This has been, starting here in the college sphere for this past year, where it's like, oh, they don't really make growth. And I think there's, two sort of pieces that I've heard, and I want you to jump in and because part of the reason I was so interested to talk to you about this is one of the things that we fight with as coaches of, college programs is we don't have the sheer volume of athletes to just almost see a bigger subset of data that helps us better understand how these things interact. And so I was kind of interested in that because I think there's maybe two arguments that I've heard out there, and both of them strike me as reasonable, but also I fight with them. One of those is this idea that, well, you haven't gotten the right program for that person, right? You haven't individualized it enough, and if you just individualized it correctly, they would see velocity growth. And I'm like, okay, that makes intuitive sense to me. So I must just stink as a coach, quite frankly, because I have these guys who maybe don't gain as fast as other people. And then the other piece is this idea of like, um, I really respect the people who say this, but like God doesn't make junk, right, or something like that. Like the human tissue has to adapt, so all you got to do is find the right adaptation. And so it kind of goes back to the first one a little bit, but I'm also like, I don't know, like I've just seen guys who just roll out of bed and throw 90, and like that's different. I don't think they trained for that. And you're telling me that I can take the guy who throws 78 and get him to 90? Like, I don't know, maybe somebody out there can. So would you just speak to that? Because that's the one piece for me, if I was playing devil's advocate, that I'm like, I think I agree with you in general. Like I want skillful pitchers, and I think throwing harder, it feels like we have some better ideas how to do that. But sometimes I just fight with like, man, I'm struggling to get this guy to gain velo.
Yeah, and I've had those too. I'm not saying that like I know all and I can develop everybody to gain velocity. Um, like I mean, one of Boyum's former pitchers, and he was like, hey, like I want to get to that next level, and my coaches want to see a little bit more velocity. And I was like, okay, like that's fine. We're gonna sell out in the weight room. We're not gonna do traditional velocity days, but we have some things that we can work on that can probably improve. And honestly, we didn't see it all summer. But what he did see was like, wow, I have become a better pitcher. I know how to use my stuff. And I only had him for 2.5 months, but I got to check in with him to see how he's doing. But I wouldn't be shocked if it's just a delayed, what's the word I'm looking for?
Like it shows
Delayed.
up, yeah, like the velo shows up later.
Yeah, because we ran a variation of Jake Tura's hypertrophy clusters. If you know what that is, it's just like an 8x5, and then a phase of 10x4, and then a phase of 12x3 for the core lifts, because like he just needed to get stronger. Like that was like a low hanging fruit for him. So I was like, hey, would you want to try this? I've seen success with it. And then that way the velocity is developed in the weight room and medicine balls, and that's where we're going to work on it. But every time we pitch, we're working on skill. We're working on how our stuff is going to work against hitters and how it's going to play off of each other. And he's like, yeah, sure. He didn't lose any, but he was able to sustain that velocity that he had through that crazy lifting protocol, which I think is a win, because he should have gone way down for a while and he didn't. But then I've also had other athletes where it's like, yeah, they just didn't gain velocity, and you also just don't know like what they're doing outside of training with you. It's very possible that they're doing all the right things, but then when I talk to those kids that don't gain anything other than the athlete I just gave an example of, I ask them what they ate for breakfast. Like, what are you eating? A bowl of cereal, and then I go to work and then I come here. I was like, okay, it's 3:00. What have you had since then? Nothing. I'm like, is that normal? Like we've talked about nutrition when we first started, like things like that start to pop up more often than not. And I'm not trying to put the blame on the athlete, just because I was a college athlete. We were all college athletes. Like it gets hectic, and yeah, sometimes you forget to eat because the college life it just gets busy. But I just think that there's so many more factors out there as why they don't. And I don't know. I don't think it's, oh, you haven't found the right program or you have to find the right stimulus. I just think that also not everybody was meant to throw hard. Like, I think that's another thing too. Like you can train all you want, you can do all the right things, but maybe you never get to 90, but you go from 78 to 84, 85 and play at a really good Division two and you ball out there, right? Like, I
Aren't
think
we
we just have
alluding
to accept
to
it.
as well to like dynamical systems theory, like this idea that learning is nonlinear?
Yeah,
And
it's
it seems like so many people, what they want is they want, hey, this is the formula for, yep. And if I put the right inputs in, I just
mhm,
have to find the right inputs. And you see
yeah.
this all, whether it's categorization systems, we've talked about those in the past. Like, oh, if you just categorize the person right, it'll unlock XYZ. If you just get the right program, it'll unlock XYZ. We know that there's
Mhm.
a relationship between working hard and finding the right
Yeah.
things. And yet it's nonlinear, you know. You're gonna have some people with a small input makes a huge change. You're gonna have people with big inputs that just seemingly doesn't make changes, and it's not gonna go according to your schedule.
hmm
And I think too that guys don't understand how much, like, say, for example, the eating piece. I only gained 10 pounds in 4 years of lifting in college, and I thought I was eating a lot, but it was not until after college that I really learned how much I had to eat just to gain weight. And I think that's, guys, especially, I mean, we were talking before we started recording about like the difference between a 2 year and a 4 year. Um, even within 2 years, guys make a lot of mistakes early on as far as like what they're doing, and how they're approaching it. And so I think that oftentimes is a larger piece of it. I mean, I know we're kind of banging on the idea that it's, it's not just about finding the right stimulus, but I kind of think, it really is in terms of when you manage their workload and their recovery well, you should see adaptation. And I do think going back to like the basics, like specificity matters. When we start thinking about, okay, if I want to develop velocity that translates to the mound, maybe I need to be doing my velo training on the mound. I mean, I know we've, at our program kind of laughed at some of the velo that we see when they're throwing into a net right in front of them, even if they're throwing off a mound. But I do think there's a time and a place for everything. Like, if your goal is for your body to experience going fast and throwing at that velo, then there's value to that. In the same way that there's value to a run and gun. And this was where, to me, this is going back to what you were saying before, Tanner, I agree. I think having the background in S&C and to be able to think like through S&C principles of periodization and of just basic, how does the body adapt to different stimulus, and then like what are the adaptations that you want and how can you find the methods to achieve that, becomes very like a very key piece. Because going back to the workload piece, like understanding that and like having a periodization model for that and a way of thinking about that is, to me, in some ways that is the art and the challenge in some ways. But also, um you have those principles set you up to be able to do that. And so, because I think even one of the other pieces that I think that plays into this is, why is it that some guys want to bring a guy in who has velocity, is that there's an inherent risk of trying to develop it. So, but on the same piece of it, if you want to reduce the injury risk, one of the things that we talk a lot about, or like a lot of people talk about, is like workload management. And so, when it comes to workload management, I also think you layer in there like recovery, nutrition, managing those things. Like, you have to manage all these different pieces, and it's a really challenging thing to do. But at the same point, I think it's still doable. But at the end of the day, like, guys got to want it, and like I think that's where a lot of young guys, like I was saying before, just don't understand how much they have to be paying attention to these different pieces and how all these pieces play in. Some guys are lucky. They're, because these guys are, still really young. And so their testosterone is just absolutely through the roof. And some guys are able to take advantage of that way better than others. So I think we also have to like understand, to Kyle, to your point of like, well, what about the guy who just rolls out of bed and throws 90? Well, I mean, some of it is the genetic side of it. And then how much of it too is like, I even think like, because intent drives adaptation. So what was their intent as a kid growing up? Is it something like that who drove a lot of how hard they threw? Could it be other factors of things that they did outside of baseball that played into developing, how their tissue is? I think we kind of don't give credence to the fact that it's not just like it's magic. There's probably a story behind how they got to where they are.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to hear each of us just answer that question, even though I'm quite sure that we'd all be on a similar plane with it. I would love to hear you sort of defend, would you at MASH rather work with a highly skilled pitcher and then try to develop velocity to help him reach his goals? Or, Boy Mirai in the college sphere, would we rather see a pitcher who is throwing hard and we're having to develop those skills? Which one of those would you sort of prefer, and sort of defend your position and why? Go ahead,
You want me, you
Pruitt.
want me, you want me to go first? Okay.
Yeah, you jump.
So not everybody is the same, but there is, like, I don't want to call it a stereotype, but when you work with an athlete that is highly skilled and needs velocity, they tend to then get super domed up about the velocity and then forget about the skill completely. And I don't want to say it's hard to work with them, but it's always like, hey, remember, we still have to get outs. Hey, remember, like, don't worry about mechanics. We got to focus on the task. Hey, remember, like, what the goal is. Remember what the important thing is. And obviously, that's our job as coaches. But I think I would rather work on the guy that has the velocity. Again, this is in the private sector, and work on the actual skill, because that guy knows he can already throw hard and he's not even worried about any of that other stuff. He's just like, I need to get outs. And then they become so focused on the task. And I actually think you see more growth there as far as the skill goes. And like my last job where I just had a huge plethora of athletes, it was interesting because it was the guys that already threw hard that say, I need to work on the skill, that actually gained more velocity because they weren't worried about it. And then through gaining confidence in the skill, it was like something unlocked. I don't know what it is, or I guess I shouldn't. Their degrees of freedom were no longer frozen because they weren't so worried about command. It was like they were freed up, and they saw more gains because obviously they were still in the weight room and doing the other things and taking care of their nutrition and recovery. But it was like we brought their focus away from velocity, and they still saw more of an increase than the athlete that had the skill but obsessed over the velocity.
So are you saying that you'd rather develop the skill side of it rather than develop velocity?
Yes.
So then through that argumentation, you would say you'd rather recruit guys that have the velo.
Well, that's in the private sector.
Sure.
Right? Like, I think again, I was only a college pitching coach for one season, not even a fall, but like I want the guys that know how to get outs. And I think when I was on the field with guys, it was like, yes, they wanted velocity, like those athletes, but at the same time, like they were inundated with, we need to win games right now. So whatever you got to do to win games, that's what we're going to do. And so again, I don't know if it's easier in my mind, I'm not a college coach. I was, again, for one semester, but like, I just think it would be easier, right, as a college coach to get the elite outgetters. And usually the elite outgetters are not lifting as much as they should be, from my experience. So then it's like, okay, you're going to get a lot of baby gains if you can take this seriously and develop that way. I think one of the responses from Turner, and it's kind of on the screen there, is like, as respectful as I can be, I'm afraid there's a lot of bad coaching out there, both on-field performance and S&C. So trusting that to go well is a little silly or a little iffy. And I think like if you can have a strength coach or somebody you trust, you're like, hey, this is his focus. Like what can we do in the weight room to help drive the adaptations? I'll worry about the throwing volume and just make sure we continue to maintain this skill.
Well, that's where I do think, like, in the future, like, this is where I like guys like Bill Miller, right? Even yourself, who understand both and can program both. Because when you start taking both into account, then you can manage those workloads a little bit more effectively. And then Kyle, I mean, we've talked about this too, about timing when you're going to do the lift versus versus your skill work. That can be really challenging. I mean, where I'm at, we'll lift before practice. So guys are doing all their lifting before their skill work, which is less than ideal, but it just comes down to the fact of logistics. Like we don't want guys there till like 8 or 9 p.m. at night, like after practice. Okay, guys, you're going to have to now go to the weight room. Now it's 6 or 7, and some of it too is just like as coaches, we don't want to be there because we don't have a strength coach. We don't want to be there till like 8 or 9 at night. And so I think that plays into, because otherwise it's like, oh, when I had my first stint here, I had guys come in and lift at like 6 a.m. because that's just the easiest time to get them in. But that was brutal, like waking up and all that sort of stuff. And so now we do it in the middle of the day, which I think is much, much better. But there's some downsides. Like, really at the end of the day, you're just trying to do the best. An imperfect plan, executed consistently is better than the perfect plan that gets executed, haphazardly. So I think that's kind of, something to keep in mind as well. But the other thing, I think it also depends, what I didn't bring up before is what's our time window that we have to work with guys, right? So Tanner, you brought up, 2 months. 2 months is challenging to make significant gains sometimes because of the short window that you have. I do think maybe 3 to 4, to 6 months, like you can do a lot more with that. You also have time to make adjustments to try some different things to figure out how they respond. But this is too where I think the deeper S&C principles start to come into play here of, do you have a way to evaluate what a player needs? Because not every guy needs strength. Like, yeah, okay, maybe they haven't lifted a ton, but if you start and you evaluate, their what the heck is it called? Their strength, was it strength speed index? What is it? I haven't used this word in a long time. But basically, like trying to figure out, is their system more? Is there a deficit more on the strength side, or is there a deficit more on the speed side? And that plays big. Yeah, and because I remember my first stint at DCTC, when I was doing the lifting, the mindset there at that point was, and this is what I heard from all the strength coaches: oh, you just need to get them stronger. You just need to get them stronger. And so that's what we did. We chased getting stronger. And I can't remember. I think I was reading through some of Bill's stuff recently, and it's just like the maxes, chasing maxes oftentimes doesn't transfer. He's like looking at improving velocity and also like how, I can't remember what the other one was. Part of it was like the velocity of the movement, tracking that had a bigger impact on like seeing increases in velocity, whether it's bat speed or throwing velocity or whatever. And that just makes more sense for what we're doing, because, yes, although your max output can go up, but there's no time constraint on that. But when we play, we have to be able to produce force in a short window. And so going back to my first stint at DCTC, we had a kid who was super strong in the weight room, but he was only throwing 75. And it was like, oh, that kid could have used a lot more speed work, and so having a way to assess what a kid needs as far as, where he sits on the spectrum, because some of it too is if you improve some of the other tissue qualities, such as like, how well they use their stretch shortening cycle, right? And how elastic their tissues are. You can also see a gain in velocity. Maybe you don't see a gain in their physical mass, because obviously, there's mass oftentimes helps guys throw harder. But there are those outliers where you're like, you aren't very big, but yet you freaking throw the ball super hard. So I do think it's a both and that shows you that sometimes where a guy needs to make gains is more in changing the type of tissue that he has versus giving him more tissue. Obviously, some of those things go together, but at the same point, having a way to evaluate guys and what what they need, I think becomes a key part of this puzzle.
Yeah, I'm searching for a tweet that talked about at one point the strength velocity profile thing maybe not being as clean cut as we thought. Because I think there's a thread there, right? There, because we're always looking for the easier input output, and I've realized like the desire to try to fight against that and try to figure out what are the principles of the processes that we believe that underpin skill development and adaptation. I want to go back to, because one interesting thing you said when you answered your question, Tanner, was like, in the private, how it would be different for you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I've noticed is that um, within the college coaching sphere now, almost every place you go, not all of them, of course, but almost every place you go, especially if you're in the NCAA, will have contact restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really challenges, like, basically you said, well, if I'm in the private, right, like I'm going to want to take the velocity, work on the skill. And my initial thought was, man, when I did a bunch of lessons back in high school with guys, I always find it hard because it's hard to find hitters. Do you have the right cage sizes? You can't really do fielders. Whereas on a team atmosphere, that's the thing I've really appreciated about instituting lives is I got all the fielders and hitters whenever I want. I got a bunch of catchers. And so I'd be interested, has that been something, like, and maybe that'll lead us into like the almost, we've alluded to it, like how much decontextualized training, if you are going to chase a little velocity, like where do you start to that search for the person? But have you found that difficult at all in the private sphere to not necessarily have the access to certain people because you're basically saying, I'd rather take the guy that throws hard and develop their skill, but skill is super contextual, right? And you don't always have the access like we do to the real thing.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, shout out to Emergence here, the Movement Academy, but like, it's just like, be creative. Like, find ways to add pressure or context even when you don't have the bodies. So, like, if I look at the collegiate program I ran this summer, right, we didn't always have hitters at first, and then we were able to get them at about halfway through when guys, were on ramped and ready to go live. Like, that wasn't an issue. But like, when we didn't, it was like, okay, like, what are you wanting to improve on other than velocity? And we had those conversations, and Johnson, and he was like, hey, I need to get better with my fastball, and I need to develop my changeup. So that was our focus. And so it was a lot of differential learning. It was a lot of like, okay, like, we're missing in certain spots, like, what can we adjust? Where can we shift our eyes to? Like, finding different ways to get them to search the landscape and potentially like talk through, like, okay, we're throwing to a 9 pocket right now. Where could you shift your eyes when you're actually throwing in a game? Like, what would you look at? And just start talking through those things, and just to kind of help them understand, like, like, it is going to be different. But then adding, like I just talked about differential learning, like, hey, we want to work on our changeup today. Every other pitch is going to be a changeup. Like, you cannot throw it back to back. Like, you have to go back to it and see if we can figure out how to throw this pitch in an effective spot or in a competitive spot at the very least. And then when we got to lives, it was like, hey, look, like, you want to work on that changeup. Can't throw any other pitch other than a changeup until you get it for a strike. Or we would add other things like that within lives because we don't have fielders and things like that. But in our winter programs, like, we get stand-in hitters more often than not. And so, like, I even posted a YouTube video about a kid I was working with and just showing him how to read hitters. Like, we weren't necessarily working counts, but we were working pitches off of each other with the stand-in there. Because, I mean, it was like, I want to say it was November. So they were like 7 weeks into throwing, and we didn't want to go live yet just because we didn't trust all of these kids to go 80% lives, even with their radar gun. So it was like, how can we add context in other ways? And it was like, hey, you got him to move this way, even though you missed your spot. Like, you were trying to go outside with your fastball and you yanked it inside and you got him to back up. Like, there's a perfect opportunity here for you to go with a changeup that starts at him and front hip it. Like, getting them to start thinking through things that way. Like, oh, I got him to move. This pitch is open, instead of, gosh, I missed my spot. Now I gotta try and be perfect here. It's like, no, you just opened up an opportunity with a miss. Like there are opportunities out there. And then going into live at bats, like yes, we're missing the whole defense and we're missing all of those things, but then we would add like, okay, we're gonna go out of a slide step against this batter, like try and be quick. Can we be quick to home plate and still get outs, still throw competitive pitches? And if we can't, okay, that's what we're gonna work on next week in our bullpen. That's the context we're gonna add. Even though we don't have the physical context, we can still, in their mind, like, okay, runner on first, you got to be below a 1.5 to the plate. Like different things like that. So yeah, I don't have as many bodies, but I feel like with being creative and just the things that I've learned through Emergence and all of their content and just my experience, it was like it's easy to add those things even when I don't have bodies. Do bodies make it better? 100%. I'm never going to say you don't need extra bodies, but the more you have, obviously it's going to be better. But I stopped looking at it as something I'm running into and just something that like I can work with.
So on that note of like having stand-ins, I remember seeing, I believe, Ari here post what they've been doing at the school that he's at, where they have a stand-in with a half bat. I've always
That's
wondered.
what we do.
Yeah, well, so the thing is like I'm curious because here their focus is on for the hitters is working on their swing decisions because they can't actually hit the ball. I wonder if their swing behavior is different because you're not actually like you can take what looks like, oh yeah, that swing right there where he like took a good swing. How do they not all look like that? Well, that's my point, is because you're not actually, you don't have a barrel that can actually hit anything. So therefore, what are you going to do to like, if you happen to be early, you're not going to go lunge forward because you don't have anything, there's no bat there to actually go try to touch it, So that's where I wonder, with these types of environments, because you don't actually have the bat, or maybe the intent is slightly different, like you can't actually swing. Maybe we'll see if some small things of like, how they move and how they're tracking it. But I also wonder if guys kind of go out to lunch a little bit because, you'll see hitters that will just swing at a breaking ball as if it's a fastball and they'll be just super out in front, but because they're just like, oh, I see a ball, now I'm going to swing. Like to me, that makes it more difficult. Maybe you can tell something as a pitcher, you learning to read that, like, oh, he didn't see that at all. But at the same point, I just wonder, the behavior might be a little bit different because of the fact that they can't actually. There's no barrel to the end of that. You may have like how they're triggering, and that is still useful information. But anyways, I'm just curious. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like when we would do that at MASH, like the reason we did half bats was because we're in cages and like there's just too many bodies. So if they swing and hit one, like not a good situation. But what we were looking more at is not necessarily the swings, but like if it was a changeup away, were they lunging out over the plate? Or if it was in, were they flinching and it wasn't even close to hitting them? Like getting a read on how their pitches are moving and do they look comfortable or do they look uncomfortable? Because if they were swinging a half bat and they looked uncomfortable, that was a good sign to me. That means like their stuff is making that hitter worried and they can't even hit the ball. Right. And I think, and I don't want to speak for our hitting coaches, but I think a lot of it wasn't necessarily about swing decisions for us or for our hitters. It was more about like trying to get their timing down as far as like that front foot and then being able to say like, nope, I was late. I misread it. And just like picking up on things like that. I could be wrong, but that's what it seemed like to me because like that was a station for their hitters program. So they would go hit off high velocity machine and then a coach throwing overhand and they would then come to the pitching area and stand in with a half bat. And so it was work on timing. And then that coach throwing overhand was like, okay, what pitches did you struggle with timing wise? And they would say, oh, curveball. All right, you're going to get a lot of those from me at 30 feet. I don't know if that was every session, but there were a handful of them where it seemed like that was the conversations that was happening.
Yeah, we would use the halfback similarly with as you alluded to in your first part of your answer with batter behavior, as opposed to, we've actually never cued. It was just something that I asked to have more in there because, you're throwing in a bullpen and it's before a game, or it's just, during practice. And it's like, no, I want somebody in there. And one of the problems with stand-ins when they're not swinging anything, is that they don't behave anyway like a batter, but if you do put something in their hand that they're going to swing, and we've tried to make it a similar weight of a bat. I think, you're alluding, Boyum, to like the reality that there are limitations to everything that we're going to do, right?
Mhm.
And so it kind of like, maybe I'm not going to let you off the hook. I want you to answer the question, but at some point we'll touch on here, like, how much are you doing the half bat? Is that some of your main lives, and then every once in a while you touch lives? You know what I mean? Or is it flipped? Like it's just a small place that you touch, similar to like pull downs. Is all you do is pull downs? Like 50 to 60 to 70% of your training, then I don't know that that's gonna transfer. But the half bat for us is just like, hey, there's this one activity that we have constraints as a coach, that we have constraints for our players, that we just have to operate around. To your point with the S&C stuff of the schedule, right? Like there are just these things. And so, okay, so how can we make this activity just a little bit more alive, a little bit more real? We've actually talked to one of my pitchers, his fall global intention he shared with me is he wanted to learn to read hitters better so that he could call more pitches on his own. So we've started to do that. And one of his homework assignments, he's going to do it, I think this next Thursday, is he has to give a presentation to our pitching staff on just the basics of helping our entirety of our staff. How do you read hitters? Like, what are the basic things that you could look at? Basically, like a 101 level. I've wanted him to think through that. So then hopefully he's almost studying at a 201, 301 to get prepared for that. But in light of that, trying to connect to those types of things in all of the environments that he's embedded in so that he can have better opportunities with a half bat. And so from there, our coaching staff, we had a conversation getting back to the half bat, is we want to create a menu of behavior for batters, both for our pitchers and our batters, of like what you could do in the box to start to communicate something. So could you change stances? Could you, as the ball's coming in, could you be farther off the plate, back of the box, front of the box, so that then when we kind of start them with this, that the half bat training might actually, even for our hitters, be more exploratory. Like, hey, I don't know, why don't you just hit in different stances, swing in different ways, lunge in different ways, like you were saying at the beginning, that it's less of practicing the right thing, but more of an exploratory activity. I think that could be pretty cool for hitters as well, and it's really going to help us as pitchers because it's like, the whole point of this guy's bullpen, let's say, is, hey, I want you to connect to his behavior, where he's at in the box, the information you're getting from his swings, the way his body's interacting. So I think that there's something there too, that we're going to go off his presentation to kind of build our own basic menu of behavior for a batter, that I hope will, again, how can we take these things that are a little bit more static and just make them a little bit more alive, engaging, variable, adaptable, all those different things. So I think that that's really important.
Yeah, for sure. And then back to the point you made, like if we're using the half bat stand in more than 50% of the time, like, yeah, that's too much. And the way we did it was like for maybe 3 to 4 weeks, and then they got 3 full months of live at bats. So it was like kind of transitioning to it. But the cool thing, you talk about variability, is it was like every 3 pitches, it was a new batter. So they had a new batter to read every 3 or so pitches, which I think is very similar to a game, right? Every 2 to 5 pitches, you're getting a new guy, and you're having to like adjust your, what you're paying attention to, adjust your intentions as a lefty versus righty. And it was like, we had a lot of fun with it, with the certain guys that were bought into like, I don't necessarily care about strikes, but make the batter move and then see what opportunities open up. Like, watch their body language. They're not swinging, but man, this guy, anytime you throw him inside, he gets really frustrated. Like, there was a guy that said, hey, can you throw one down the middle, please? I was like, are you kidding? Like, no. And so I told the guy, like, you're throwing inside this entire time. Make him uncomfortable. And so it's just kind of cool. Like, hey, that when you face him this spring, he doesn't like the inside. So there you go. Because a lot of the guys that we coach, they play against each other. So it's just like, well, there's your opportunity. So it's a lot of learning about hitters.
What would you prefer, Boyum? Let's put it in the hitting one because that's where you're at. Would you
Mhm.
prefer a guy just with like this raw EV number, but maybe he struggles a little bit skill, or would you prefer the opposite, like a skillful hitter and you got to figure out how to put a little EV on him, figure out help him hit the ball harder?
You know, I'm glad you kind of bring this up because I wanted to get back to the initial jumping off point because I want to explore like, okay, what would you rather recruit? What would you rather, bring in? And I'm going to kind of defend like you kind of need a certain floor because, you know, as we were talking about before, like a 2-year versus a 4-year, I only have so much developmental window. I can only reasonably expect to raise the floor only so much, and so I think having guys hit a certain threshold is key to being like, okay, you need to hit a certain threshold and then also have, a certain level of skill. Um, I actually think though it's easier to develop the velo than it is to develop the skill side of it. It just takes so many more. I want to say like you need a lot more of specific types of reps that are harder to get to develop the skill, just based upon logistics and like the more complex nature of what actually develops skill. Um, being able to hit all sorts of different types of pitches done in different sequences out of a live hand. Those are reps that are are hard to come by in the off season unless you have a good, developmental system globally as a team. Like I'm not just talking hitters, like I'm talking the pitchers and hitters are to like their development is in tandem together. Um, if you don't have that, I think it's harder to develop the skill of contactability. Um, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's more challenging. Um, Whereas to develop bat speed, literally you can do that in your garage with a tee. So there's, I think though, going back to though the whole dichotomy though of okay, developing velo versus developing skill. I think going back to that though is the transferability. Yeah, I can be in my garage, swinging super fast off the tee or off of flips or whatever it is. This is about to go off on the fact that the underload bats or the training bats are not designed for hitting real baseballs. That blew my mind. It moving game speed. That blew my mind when we got a hold of some. Um, so then that exacerbates the problem further, and so I think that's where the transferability of like the skill. But I think that comes back to like we as coaches need to be better. At the end of the day, it really comes down to your skill level. Because we were just at a showcase yesterday, and our head coach, told the players like, you know, he, in talking with other coaches, they're basically, said something to the effect of like, bad coaches recruit showcase players, versus the more skilled coaches are going to look at more of the complete player. The Twins just cut, 5 scouts from their staff, and people are like, yeah, what do scouts do? We can just use all the metrics. And it's like, yeah, but if you talk to any scouts, they're not there looking at the radar gun the majority of the time. That's not what they're there for. That's not why you send a scout to go watch a player. You send a scout to go watch all the things that the metrics don't pick up. Like, how do they interact with their teammates? How do they behave, when something doesn't go their way, when, they're getting hit around or they have a call go against them, like all these things that, you're not measuring with a radar gun, with a TrackMan or with Hawkeye or whatever, these are the other elements. And so that's where I think the skill side of this, as coaches becomes really, really important. Can you blend these things and understand how all these things work together?
What's interesting to me is I'm trying to rack my brain for a kid that I coached in my past who I would qualify as low, low velocity, if you will, and highly skilled. And and I think part of it might just be you have to decide what level you're at, um, and to your point, Boyum, where's that floor? Because I might answer the question that like, which one do I want? Probably both right now because I don't have my mind made up. You know, I I'm intrigued with the guys who throw really hard and like we throw them in a ton of live environments. I'm super intrigued as to whether or not we can develop skill differently than others because I truly do believe that we throw more lives than anybody else. Like I think we had 44 practices during the spring and at all but four of those we threw lives that during the competitive season. Um, and and so I'm intrigued with that. Like my theory is that like they'll get better at pitching and they have this raw stuff, and so I'm intrigued with that. But I also, concur with you guys that I think that the raw output you could get better at, and yet the floor piece, the genetic piece, the nonlinearity of development of even just the raw output makes me nervous at times, as well as just the acknowledgement of like how effective can we be if we're throwing all these lives. Where is the tipping point to the amount of decontextualized training that one needs to do, to your point, to throw into a net really hard to just expose the body to speed? The problem is it was kind of like a running joke. My brother's he's a head coach at a college, and he would text me and his other one of his former who works in the Twins organization. He would text us and like say, "Oh, hey, here's this guy with his video from this, academy who, 88 to 90. We faced him today, 82 to 84. 9 runs in 3 innings." Like it just kind of became a running joke. It's like because you do so much decontextualized training and decontextual. Like I'm when I talk to recruits now, who prospective recruits are a recruiting presentation, I compare throwing bullpens to targets like Sean compares doing cone drills. Like I think they're kind of the same. Like I think not facing a live hitter is about the same as a football player doing cone drills. I really do. I think they're totally different skills, and my evidence is how often you can be terrible in a bullpen and great in a game, or vice versa. Awesome in the bullpen, terrible in the game. I think that they're totally different things. So I fight and wrestle with that too. Like how much can I really grow somebody's velocity, as well as just the reality of that piece of it, like the how much decontextualized training do I need to do in order to see a bump, and how much of that will transfer? Will I just get more transfer if I just throw lives and the intention of those lives is velocity and velocity only? Now I can't throw weighted balls in those lives. Maybe I can. Maybe at some point I'll start using like 4.5, 5.5 ounce balls to just expose them to something different. But I feel like that's where I'm struggling a little bit, where I might actually lean at times just with the way we have crafted our environment to the guy who has a little bit more raw stuff. Because I wonder, my theory is like, I wonder if we can get him better at the skill side of it because we do so many lives. But I'm not really sure if that's going to be true at all.
I wish I had more of the I couldn't find my raw data, but for example, I think it's easier to develop velocity than it is to develop skill. I mean, because we just some of it was we did have some better players, like the kid who hit 114 exit velo in game. He was new to the team and he already hit the ball really hard when he got here. He didn't hit 114 though in the fall, so there is that. I mean, he was hitting it like 108 or something like that. Like he was hitting the ball hard. It was already north of 100, but you can see that like our average exit velocity did rise, and even the kid who had the lowest exit velocity, because the thing that we changed, one is I did more weighted bats this past year, and we were more consistent with our rotational work. So you combine those two things, guys, just motor output ability, I think, was better this year. And also, and on the skill side, I guess it's hard to say. Like, we scored fewer runs, but it's because we also had 44 less hit by pitches. We had 7 fewer walks, but I think that 7 fewer walks is so minimal that it, like, you can just kind of chalk that up to being like, granted, the kid who hit it 114, he didn't walk very much. So you have those two things, but it's surprising with one guy only walking a handful of times, you're only missing 7 walks from the previous year. But so with that being said, though, like our other numbers were up, but I don't know how to really evaluate. Did we really get that much better? Because like our batting average was only slightly up, and how much does that have to do with the level of competition that you're playing? Granted, we did actually play better competition this past season than we have in the past. But at the same point, like, I think that's where it becomes harder to measure how well did you improve the skill in certain facets. Just looking at their traditional stats. I know, Kyle, we've talked about, how well is it, or how good is it, or how much value is there in comparing stats from season to season, because the context is different. But at the same point, like, I can look at this and see, like, okay, I have the numbers between guys, between 2 seasons. I can look at their exit velocity, their max, and their average, and I could see that by and large everybody's went up this year versus the previous year, even looking fall to spring. And so that's where I just think it's just easier to do that. Now, getting it to show up in game, I think, is the other element, and that's where I was pleasantly surprised that it was showing up in game, because we had a kid all off season. Granted, now this has to do with a little bit of our equipment, but off the hit tracks, this one kid was living 75. 75, maybe hit an 83, and then one time in live hit a 90, 91, 93, and you're like, I don't know, is that real? Because like, I watch you in training all the time, not hitting the ball hard. Then we get into the season, and of his like 7 at bats, and his four hits that he got, like 3 of them were 90 plus. And I think there were a couple of 93s in there, and you're like, well, I guess that 93 was real, And so I think that's where for me, like, okay, is this transferring to the game? And that was the one kid that hit the ball that well, in the limited opportunities he had. He was one of the few guys that got in my cage for short box and wanted a bunch of extra reps. And so I look at, like, yes, the skill side is I think harder to develop because it's way less linear. Like, when it comes to strength and conditioning and improving the motor output, it's more linear. Partially because, like, we've done it more. Like, for example, Bondarchuk, he's developed a way to, track the dose response and how the body adapts to the doses that you give it from a training standpoint. And so we have some information and studies looking at, okay, if I implement this type of program after X number of weeks, what does the output look like? How much improvement do we see, or whatever? What's the response? There's not as much research as far as, and plus there's a lot of confounding factors when it comes to developing the actual skill component of it. Because, going back to, I think we might have mentioned this before, but your mental state plays a huge role. Your mental emotional state plays a huge role in the skill that you're able to express and the way that you're able to connect with the environment, all that sort of stuff. And so I do think it's more challenging, but at the same point, this is to me where, the value of a coach becomes so important and vital, and what you can do.
Let me ask this question. Do you think that, velocity is more linear because it actually is, or because our systems are currently set up that way. And it's probably a little bit more nuanced and mixed, but hear me out here. Like, I don't know that you'll go to a single program in the country and you'll roll out to practice and they're just going to start playing, right? Like, they're going to do drills, they're going to have machines, they're going to have cages. It's going to be a lot of, and I don't say this poorly, because I think that there's a purpose to it. I don't think it's fully decontextualized practice, but it is, right? It's not the real thing. And I'm curious if somehow the system was set up, or we're in a 40 years ago where we don't have all those fancy things, and the only thing you can do to get hitting practice is for kids to throw to each other, or you're just playing in the backyard. Would we say the same thing if we were in an alternate universe where the norm was just that you played the game more? Would we go, yeah, man, skill's so much easier because that's all you do? Whereas our current system is academies that are a little harder to do that live interaction, practices where you go to every convention and they're going to tell you all the drills that you do that are, decomposed, that then will apply. Like, pretty much our entire system seems to be built up to lend itself to the more linear model, which we're acknowledging dynamical systems theory is pushing back again. So any thoughts on that? It was just one question that came to mind as you were talking about the linearity, the more linearity, which I agree with actually, of velocity, but does it have anything to do with our systems?
I think so. I mean, that's where these things have been kind of tried already, right? There's a ton of information out there. I mean, when I think about it, most of the time, within any community, that people are just going to they more often want to do what they know is going to work and what they've seen other people do. And so this model has already been developed, with people like Driveline kind of pioneered it a little bit. Not just them, but I think like Texas Baseball Ranch and a few others, right, have kind of pioneered this model of development from an academy standpoint. I even think on the S&C side, like Eric Cressy, right, like all the work that they did to make lifting important. And then Driveline, showing that you can develop velocity, that it's not just a genetic God-given thing. And so I think it's opened the window for people to be able to copy that model. I mean, I think this is the same thing, could be said of like, Tanner's situation, both the fact of being in a facility, but also like the travel teams. Like, travel teams are everywhere. People are replicating that. Or even too, like, Driveline's model is based off of Eric Cressy's model, from a business standpoint. So, right, like people are looking to like replicate success that other people have had. And so that's where I do think on the skill side, there's this, what I think the point of this podcast is that there's this open window for the development of skill now at a level that we haven't seen before. But at one point in time, the low-hanging fruit was the development of the physical side of things. Because I think it was before, actually, because, when I was at Missouri State, the comment is like, we used to just scrimmage all the time. Like, that was fall, was just a ton of scrimmaging. And I think you've seen a move away from that towards more of a developmental mindset that is, compartmentalizing all these things. And so now there's this big open window again to develop the skill side, because everybody now, generally speaking, understands the importance of the development of the physical aspects of it. Because I mean, again, if you neglect that, you're going to get left behind, like the physical side of things, because it's almost ubiquitous. But at the same point, I do want to say, like, on the velo side, I think, a lot of people just focus on maybe the weight room to develop the velocity, and I think it's not just that, because the weight room won't always develop velocity for everybody. Everything's on a bell curve, right? And so I think as coaches, we need to, like, this is again going back to, like, I think periodization is really a helpful tool, because the way that I look at it is just it's a way to plan out your year. and start to think about like what are the different phases and how can we work in these different pieces. Because I'm thinking about it like using a nutrition analogy or a meal analogy. How are you going to get in all the necessary nutrition that you need within a meal? And I start to think about like the overall athlete development in terms of that, of like how are you going to fit all these different pieces in there. And what I've seen from other people looking in at their programs and stuff is that oftentimes like they're missing some of these either macro or micronutrients within their program development or their player development. Maybe they have lifting in there, but they don't have a velo component to what they're doing. There's no, or maybe they're missing more of like the skill, the representativeness is missing, right? So like trying to lay out like, okay, what are all the components that go into this that make up a healthy player, and how do we layer in and make sure we're touching on all these qualities that a player needs. And that's where periodization, I think, really is useful, because that, like, all those types of things are layered into what periodization is. I was looking at, I was talking with a track coach from college, and they just simply had a way of tracking like how frequently did they touch on different qualities, and be like, okay, at what level were we implementing this quality? Was it a high volume, low volume, no volume? And like how long ago did we touch on this? Like all those types of things start to become, I think, important into like how do we develop players. Like you want to have a well balanced diet.
What have you seen anything, Tanner, on your side from just that aspect of how you are developing based on the time of the year? Because obviously you just alluded to it, maybe seeing a kid for a summer, just a few months, maybe staying in contact with them through their competitive season, and you're having to work in conjunction. How have you tried to balance those things?
Yeah, it is tough. It's a fun problem to try and attack, but to me it always goes back to the athlete. Like, what is your lowest hanging fruit? Let's attack that, and then sprinkle in everything else that we need to expose you to. And then it's like, once that lowest hanging fruit is taken care of, like, okay, what can we add more of from your, I guess, going off of Boyum's nutrition thing, like, what other macro or micronutrients do we need to add more of? Now that we've taken care of the protein, right? Like, what else do we need more of now that we've taken care of that? I don't know. I don't know if I look at things through like, are they challenging or are they not? It's just something that I'm constantly trying to figure out, I guess. Um, our winter programs, it's a lot, I don't want to say easier, but we have 5 months with them. So I don't do the S&C for those guys in our winter programs. Our strength staff takes care of it. And we try to communicate with each other the best we can of like, hey, this is what we see. This is how we're programming. But as far as like the skill side and the throwing side of things, it's a lot easier to touch on everything just simply because we have more time. And when you have less time with an athlete, it's just like, what's the lowest hanging fruit? Sprinkle everything else in. And it's less of a periodization thing and just more of, what do you need? And again, sprinkle in every other stimulus or um, whatever else they need to work on. It's kind of a vague answer, but I just feel like it's so different with every athlete. Like, I had one that just simply needed strength and needed to get their spine to not be a 2x4. I had another guy that needed to get over the fear of throwing a changeup. I had another guy that had a really good lower body as far as strength and power goes, but the upper body just wasn't there. It was interesting. I don't see that very often. So it was like, okay, we're going to hit upper body strength, lower body power, and a little bit of strength there. And we're just going to see how it goes for the first couple weeks. And if we see good things, we'll keep going. So it's just every athlete just has something different that needs to be attacked. I've had some where heavy lifting doesn't work. So it's a lot of ballistic training, a lot of plyometrics, a lot of power, speed, just moving things fast. And we saw results from that. So it's just really understanding the athlete, what they feel they need. Because usually, I don't want to say that they're right all the time, but they're usually on the right track. Like they're not so wrong where it's like, wow, that's way off. It's like, no, that probably means something to you, and it's probably valuable to you because you know your body. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question, but
It's helpful, and I think we've all kind of alluded to it at different points. But one of the challenges within this conversation of like velocity versus skill development is it feels like if a guy's already done something velocity wise and you just develop the skill, we're all acknowledging that that's challenging given the environments, but there's a downside risk to velocity development. We've alluded to the skill side of it, the transferability, certainly injury. Is there anything that, Boy, you and I talked a little bit about this just as we were prepping, like this was the thing that you really wrote down, like, you only have so many eggs you can throw in a basket. Where would you go with like the downside risk of like having to go, yeah, he's skillful and we have to go all in on velocity. Where do you see the downside risk coming in that approach?
I mean, I think for what you're describing there, I think it becomes a question of like, what does the player want? If they're wanting to go play at the next level, they may need to be able to hit a certain floor in order to get to that next spot. And so I think that's where it can be challenging. And I've seen it too, where there's what we need for our program, and then there's what you need for you to move on. And those two things don't always align. And and that makes it tough. But at the same point, I do think it's important for coaches to think about, okay, given their time period with the athlete, in our context of a 2 and a 4 year, there should be a window in which you can develop these things. And you have to, not be, because I do think some coaches are so tied to certain ideas of like what their I want to say periodization, but like, what their off season looks like, or their different phases of the year look like, that there's no flexibility. Like it's just a one size fits all. Um, and it's not to say that some coaches won't, depart from that but it's like such unique cases. It's like, maybe we need to think about this more at an individual level of like, instead of it just being blanket statements of like, everybody's doing a velo, program and doing pull downs, to the other extreme of like, everybody's doing a shutdown, for, 1 to 2 to 3 months or whatever. And so I think you have to begin to think about that as far as like, because to me, this is going back to like, if we think about periodization, on the pitching side, if we're talking about like injury risk, I think there's things you can do to mitigate your injury risk. That's going to mitigate injury, both not for the development of velocity, but also longevity for the season, right? So if you do it right, if you build up the work capacity for a player to do velo, and you build it so that they have more capacity to do a lot more higher intensity training, then if you do that correctly and you periodize in deloads and whatnot, you should set them up to be in a good position when it comes to the season to have greater capacity and workload and being built up to be able to handle the workload for the season. Because I think for me, this is where I'm not the biggest proponent of shutdowns unless you have a big long window to on ramp. But then, okay, this to me is like the traditional mode, is most guys will just on ramp guys for the season. Okay, great. When did you work on any sort of skill? Because when you're on ramping, it's very hard to work on skill at the same time as on ramping. I'm not saying you can't do it. You absolutely can. But most people don't think that much about like how to blend the two together. It's one or the other. It's kind of binary. So, that's where you have to ask that question of like, okay, when you're doing your planning and you're sitting down, you're looking, and you're like, okay, I'm going to on ramp guys for the next 2 months, and then we're going to start doing our preseason where we need to get guys built up, which to me is still an on-ramp, built up to be able to, have a pitch count of, 70 to 80, so we can go start playing games. All right. In that whole process, when are you working on developing pitches? When are you working on, increasing a guy's velocity if the lifting program isn't doing that for you? Like all those things kind of play in of like, okay, so again, are you addressing these different components of the skill? And, okay, great. You're doing lives, but when are you working on holding runners? When are you working on, being able to get outs, fielding your position, whatever, like other game situations, like all that has to be kind of worked into what you're doing, going back to that whole well-balanced diet analogy.
It makes me think I when I was at high school, I'd like to do the same thing here so I can better understand velocity growth. And I'm more looking for normative ranges. So in Iowa, we play summer baseball. So I would actually get eighth graders every year. And what I would do is I would write their average velocity just in a simple Excel sheet. And then I'd list every single kid, even the kids that didn't stay with us, even the kids that quit after their ninth or 10th grade year. And the point is I would do the math, right? And I just have some equations and I'd go from one year to the other and I'd say, what was their growth over year to year? And then I'd have a column for all of our, here's our eighth to ninth graders. Here's each person's average. And then I'd start to do, mean, median, things like that. And I do that for their whole career. Because what I wanted to know was what's just normative growth for an eighth grader, from their eighth to ninth grade year. And what are we doing that might be benefiting from that? Like, and who are the guys who had higher levels of growth and why was that? I remember I had one kid that I think it was his sophomore, junior year. He had a huge spike, something like 6, 8, or 10 miles an hour, but it was just because he started lifting, And so it would start to answer the questions for us in terms of like, what are the things, like what's just natural human progression? Because they're just getting, like, I'm seeing some of our sophomores throw and I'm like, oh, he doesn't look like a freshman anymore, and oh, his first gameplay, like he throws a little harder. How much was that us? And how much was that just him growing up? And so have you guys done anything like that, Pruitt? Like do you have any internal systems that allow you to, because again, you have such a huge data set and you're working with such a wide swath of people. Do you have any systems that help you understand anything like that?
I, it wasn't really a system, but it was a conversation amongst coaches at my last job. And we were just talking like, because we would get all these athletes that are just like expecting these huge, again, from freshmen in high school to potential pro guys or even pro guys, like a lot of these athletes are expecting these huge velocity jumps like within 5 or 6 months. And we're all kind of experiencing this. We're talking about it, and like someone asked the question, like, what are we finding is the average velocity? Like, what is it? And when I think the consensus was when you sold out for just velocity, if you took about the average, now we didn't actually do the math here, but just like thinking through it, it was a half a mile an hour a month. Like that's just kind of what we saw. And again, and that's selling out for velocity. Are you going to have outliers on both ends? For sure. Are you going to have guys that maybe they gain, and I had this happen, he gained 12 miles an hour in a year, not because we sold out for it, but he was a completely untrained individual. So he gained 12 miles an hour in a year, and then that next year he gained like 4. So it's like, again, wide range, but overall long term, average of a half a mile an hour a month is kind of what we saw things as. And at MASH, we're finding the same thing, and we're not even selling out for velocity. It's like we are going to do as much skill work as we can in a facility over the winter where we don't always have the ability to go full context, but we're going to try, right? There's always limitations, but we're going to do our best to do more. And we're finding that I think it's in 5.5 months, we're averaging 3 miles an hour, like gained, without that being the focus, just simply from what we're doing. So it's just we're just finding that half a mile an hour a month or 6 miles an hour a year is like the norm. And I don't know if you guys have found that at all, or if you guys like would agree or disagree, but like that's just what I found, and that's kind of how I base success off of,
I mean,
according to velocity, not, but like the guy wants to gain velocity. It's successful if we're getting about a half a mile an hour a month.
I wonder too how much that has to do with like the age group that you're working with, right? Because you work with like such young athletes to high school. I mean, that's where their peak growth window is, like as far as like maturity wise, like physical maturity, and how much, again, going back to like the hormones piece, like they have such an advantage given all the hormones that they have flowing naturally through their body. Because what I've seen, at least where I'm at, and even too when I did some velocity development, what was interesting to me in the 2 years that I ran kind of a driveline style velocity deal, I didn't really see actually that much gain in velocity, like pitching wise. I mean, granted, our window was maybe 8 weeks. Um, but what I did see, I mean, I saw like from fall to fall, an increase of like 1 to 2 miles an hour. And then because at that time we weren't tracking like we track now. We didn't have flight scope, but it seemed as though guys' velo didn't peak in game until like midway through the season. Once it started to warm up, we've been playing for a while. Then guys' numbers would kind of pop up to would jump up, like because we had one kid in the fall my first year, he was like 80 to 81. Then the next fall he came in, he was like 83. And then somewhere in the spring he hit 86. He was like 86, maybe 88. And like that made sense from like just watching him move or whatever, but like you're just like, man, why is everybody's velo down? We're trying to develop velo, and I didn't really see an amazing jump in velo. We had nobody hitting nines or anything like that, right? And so that and even in our current system, we had like a kid come in, his velo, we had seen it up higher before, but he was basically like 78 to 83 ish, like when he's really on. And it wasn't until the spring and like halfway through the spring that he was back up to 86, and started sitting like 84, 85. So I mean, that's where I wonder if like the velo starts to level off potentially once they get to college, because of the fact that yes, they still have a lot of testosterone, but like it's not. I wonder if it's starting to dip from its peak, and so we don't see necessarily without in my opinion, without all the supporting stimulus, we don't always see the consistent rise. But I'm kind of curious, Kyle, what you've seen with your guys. Obviously you're into year 2, so it might take a couple more years to really get a feel for the college guy and how he develops. But I mean, I think to your point, Kyle, real quick before you jump in, you do see that efficiency. Guys begin to move smoother. That tends to play a role. So and also to jump back a little bit, I've also seen, Tanner, to your point of like not chasing velo, I've seen jumps in velo. So in my opinion, if you layer in a really good on ramp and you really build up their work capacity, oftentimes that alone unlocks velo for guys. Why? Because now their body feels safe enough to actually give full effort, or they can sustain higher effort for longer. So just by that alone, you can see jumps in velo. And so I've, doing a long on ramp, I've seen guys. My first one was seeing, and this was doing weighted balls, by the way, for work capacity, not for velo. I saw a kid go from like 80, 83 up to 87, topping out at 89. Right. So I think that's where the real, like we need to remember that on the developmental side, you don't have to always chase a certain quality to actually improve that quality.
It took me forever, but I found it. And I didn't do it my last year because I was leaving. But this was what I would do is I would just have their eighth through senior year. I'd say, here's their average velocity. I didn't want to know what they peaked at. I wanted to know their average in-game velocity. And then I would do their next year, and then here's their change. So you can see that that guy gained 8, and then 4.5, and then 1.4, and then I remember his last year it was about 1 mile an hour. So and then I was starting to see similar things. 7.5, 4.1, 7.8 growth. You're seeing all these huge numbers from their eighth to freshman year. See, some guys even went down 1 year. Here's the young man that had that transition where he started lifting, and so he saw a big sophomore to junior jump of 6.8. But it was very unlikely that a guy saw a huge. Here's a bunch of seniors: 0.8, 0.8, 3.8, 3.2. Some of that is just they started pitching more. And then I just did some numbers, min, max, and average down here so I could better understand. And you can see, again, it's not a huge data set. My goal is to do the long-term stuff, but you can see that the average for an eighth to a freshman was 6. And then you go 2, 2.9, 2.3. I didn't have as many, we had a lot more eighth to ninth graders, but then some of those kids quit. And so I think I do think it alludes to that idea of what you just said. It's very. I was trying to figure out how much of this was us, like what was our training doing, and what was just like them growing up. You know what I mean? Like, as opposed to being able to say each year our guys gain this much, or it's like, okay, so most of my guys are seeing. Here's the average eighth to ninth. So if you were above that, was there anything we did differently? What was, and how did that happen? And so my curiosity right now is alludes to what you said, Tanner, that like my curiosity is like, do you actually need to sell out for velocity, or can you like have that clarity of intention being, I'd like to do velocity in the context that you're trying to train, and then you could add constraints to help them do that over a wider breadth of places, right? So like if I have a guy right now in the fall who wants to develop velocity, what I might do is I might not. What we did last year was like we would have them throw their 15 to 30 pitches in our gameplay, where we're putting them in, two strike accounts or A3P type things, like not full scrimmages. So they're only going to throw 15 to
You're gonna
30.
have to remind us what your little
Oh yeah,
acronyms
sorry,
are.
thank you. A3P. So after 3 percentage, right? So the guys, we don't even finish the at bats. The at bats always over after three pitches. If you get ahead 1-2 or 0-2, at bats over, you win as a pitcher. If you fall behind 2-0 or 2-1, at bats over. Balls in play, it's over. So we're just highlighting that. Pitchers, obviously they throw first pitch strikes, they get ahead early in the count, and we're just like, that's the whole intention of the activity. Well, what I would do is the guy would throw in that environment, and then he'd have a day off and he'd throw a real light velo capped live if we weren't doing, more of an early in the fall, like, hey, maybe you should work on a one seam because of your profile in this way. But what I might do, I have one guy who wants to throw a little harder. That was his fall global intention when we talked during the summer. And so I might just have him throw more on those days and then just bag that next session and let him recover and then bring him back like 3-4 days later to do his next live outing, kind of go back and forth. But then the hope would be is that he's like, his velocity days are always the live days where he's in live. Now we might throw a little bit on the back end, a little bit more than that, but like, oh, could we put a base runner on in this way? Could we give him feedback, velocity feedback, on each of those things? Like, hey, can you do this? Can you throw it at a certain velocity that's realistic for you based on your current, not just out of a high knee, but a slide step too? Can you produce the same force? Can you do it with a runner at second versus a runner at first? Can you do it versus a lefty versus a righty? Can we keep the game embedded and work on velocity in that way? So I'm intrigued with that. And that's where I feel like for the guys who want to gain velo during the fall, I don't want to pull them out of the real thing to do that. I want to keep them embedded in the real thing and then figure out how we do that around it, changing the conditions so that they can do it in as many different places as possible.
Yeah, I would agree. It just seems like yes, when somebody wants to gain velocity, it's like, okay, everybody does. So to take them out, like you said, just is counterintuitive when they need to be able to perform at that velocity in game. And so like I've had guys where it's like, okay, you wanna gain velocity, you want a velo day, like get to an 0-2 count and then tell them a fastball's coming. Now you have to beat them. You're not going to tell them it's coming in a game, but like it gets a competitive juice going, at least in live at bats, to be like, hey, he knows it's coming. You know what you're throwing. Like you told him. Now go out there and beat him 1-on-1 and see if you can like get him out with it 0-2. More often than not, they completely sail it, but then they understand like, oh, I kind of have to like try and put this somewhere. So then they understand like, okay, I can't just throw fastballs as hard as I can. Like yeah, I want to go high intent in game, but I also have to have an intention to it, not just blow it by him or just throw as hard as I can. So yeah, it's like that's how I like to treat velocity days is like go live at bats, go face somebody or go do something in context or whatever it might be. Work counts at a high intent. And if you walk two guys, your bullpen's over. Like whatever it might be.
And I think too, like, as you bring up that example of doing velo against hitters, at the showcase, it was really interesting to see one of our sophomores whose velo doesn't quite match his size and whatever. I heard the story after the fact, but our pitching coach, because we're using the watches, basically just said like, rear back and let this one like absolutely eat. And he did. And it was for him like a big number that we haven't seen, at least since I've seen him. And I was just like, okay. It's funny though, because I think he might have been, up 0-2 or whatever, but the ball ended up, inside right. This kid ended up swinging, and riding up and smacking him in the hand or like the arm or something like that. And so it was kind of neat to see like him hit an 86, but because otherwise he lives in the 78 to like 83, but really in the like 80 to 82 range, and I think though sometimes though for like him and one of the other like some of the like one of the slow throwing lefties, it's like you need to throw the ball with some intent. Like in order for you to learn how to throw hard, you have to like try to throw hard. And this is going back to what you were saying too before, Tanner, of like that doesn't work for everybody. A lot of guys they tense too they tense way they tense too much. And that's why they don't throw as hard, right? Versus you free them up, you give them greater work capacity. Now they're more efficient. Now they're more free, and then things start to like just really start to flow, and then they hit their big numbers that way. And so, but I think this goes back to like we as coaches can't blanket statements, for everybody. And I think that's where I think a lot of players are confused is because like, they've heard like, oh, coaches bemoan the facility guy who's chasing velo and this and that, and they don't want to be that. And so then now they're not throwing with any intent behind their pitches. So then their velo just kind of sits in the same spot. And so I think that's where things need to take a step forward. Additionally, I think what you guys have been describing from an S&C standpoint is concurrent training, right? Where I'm concurrently training multiple different qualities. And there's this day, I want to say like tension between the traditional way of lifting, which is like we focus on one quality at a time. Because if I don't, then if I start doing multiple qualities at the same time, then we don't get much gain out of that. And I think that would explain why, we may not see big jumps in certain metrics that we're looking at because we're doing multiple different things, right? And I think from the standpoint of what we're trying to develop for a baseball player, sometimes that's okay, right? Like if I improve the skill of their ability to get outs and their velo doesn't necessarily bump as high as it possibly could, that may be okay, but at the same point, if we want the velo to show up in game, then we're actually going to have to use a kind of a concurrent model a little bit. Like you can't just do pull downs and think that that's going to transfer to the mound. It might for some guys, but for the majority of guys, it's probably not. So you're going to have to do some sort of concurrent training where you put a guy on the mound, you maybe put a guy in the batter's box or whatever. But I think this comes back to, again, using the said principle, was it specific adaptation to impose demands, right? So now we have to, if I put you on the mound and you're now throwing at high intent, that's going to be different, right? But now talking about like the blending between, okay, your perceptual depth. Okay, well, if I bring the target in, maybe I can get you to experience overspeed and what it feels like to move to throw hard, how fast I have to move to throw hard, or how I have to apply force to throw hard. But then now we blend that back into, throwing to a catcher, a target at 60 feet, maybe adding a batter, all these sort of things, need to get layered in. And so I think that going back to, again, like these S&C principles, I think there's already a language, there's already thoughts and research and theory behind all of these things. Like grabbing onto that and using that, I think, is just a quicker way than trying to recreate the wheel with coming up with our own sort of language.
I really appreciate that, because I actually, while you were talking there, I was super interested because I didn't do my last year at Altsort really. I went back and put our guys' velocities in really quick, and it was amazing how much it tracked. Like the guys who were more skillful on the mound, like saw a little higher velocity bump. The guys, and there were some guys who were just raw. I want to acknowledge that too, but there were a couple guys on there who couldn't throw strikes and saw a smaller bump or saw a decrease, And so that concurrent training, I think one of the reasons why it's so important is because what we're trying to do is throw harder in the real game. I alluded to it earlier, and like the number of times I see young men post on Twitter that like, this is how hard I throw. And then I go look at their synergy and it's 6 miles an hour lower. It's like, we want you to do the thing in the real game. And even something as simple as like, well, I can't throw strikes. Well, then your degrees of freedom are going to be frozen and you're not going to throw as hard in the game. That's just the way it is. And so if we're not embedding them in the real game, like even the guys who have talked to me about, well, I really like to, I've been reading this stuff about like really wanting to train during the summer. I go, hey, that's great. All I ask is that you have a place to at least throw live at least once every other week, because otherwise you're getting no feedback on whether your training is doing the thing that you think it's doing, And honestly, I kind of think one of the coolest places is if you had a place to like throw in a real live game every 2 weeks, because sometimes every week you can't like go as hard as you want on those off days, but like every 2 weeks, like you could throw in a real live game, and then have 2 weeks of just locked in training and then do it again. And you're constantly getting this feedback of like, okay, I'm going to take the thing that I'm training and put it in the real, the fully real environment. It doesn't, of course, mean all you do is long toss or all you do is throw into a net in between those 2 weeks. Still wanting to do to what Tanner's been alluding to, that they're trying to do so well. If I don't have this, how can I do stand-ins and intentions and attention, things like that? But I think that's what's really important to me is just, again, the full scope of analysis being the performer environment relationship, understanding why skill emerges and that velocity is a skill, and velocity can or cannot show up based on certain factors that are happening in the game. So if you're not doing it, in a way that's going to have the same information, then quite simply, it doesn't really matter how hard you can pull down into a net. Sure, you've exposed your body to it, but it doesn't matter. It's not going to show up in the game unless you've done that training, to what you were alluding to, Boyum.
Real quick before Tanner, you jump in here. I just want to highlight what you said there, Kyle, because I think it does touch on what Tanner was saying before of like how the degrees of freedom get frozen, right? Restricts your ability to express the quality of like max effort if you can't put the ball where you want it. So in order to try to put the ball where you want it, you often modulate. The first thing to go is going to be velocity, as an example. And also too, this is where I think workload matters a ton, is because if you don't have the capacity, right, to handle the workload, your velo is going to be suppressed because of the fact that you physically don't feel as well, right? If you got a little bicep tendonitis flaring up, your shoulder's a little bit tight, whatever it is, all these things play into reduced output. And so this is where, again, like focusing on something like work capacity can open up velocity simply because now you have the ability to do that more frequently, and now you're able to recover and be able to express that more. And so that's where I want to kind of highlight the fact of like, if we want to develop some of these other skills, you need some sort of like base or foundation in some other things that actually frees you up to be able to express these metrics that people are chasing.
Mm-hmm. What would you land with anything, Tanner, as we try to close this thing out so we can both get to our appointments?
Yeah, I think it's just there's so much nuance to it, right? Like, yes, we definitely want the more skillful athletes, but if they don't have the output to scale, or at least come close to scaling at the level that they want to get to, well, then we need to work on that. But we also just can't have a guy that throws hard and sprays the backstop. So I just think it's a lot of figuring out what works for the athlete. And I feel like we say that a lot, but it's meaningful. It's the truth. And if we can continue to be problem solvers, that we can have our cake and eat it too, in a sense. But to be able to have high velocity or higher velocity and more skillful pitchers.
And maybe the only thing I would add to all of it is what I think you alluded to it really early on, Tanner. It's just like the process of needing to be patient. I found that so often, like, again, looking back at this chart, these were only summer velocities that I showed. One of the things I can start building now is I'm going to have a fall and a spring, and I'm going to be able to see, again, what are the normative. I'm going to actually have a larger, I'll have a larger data set because, in high school, we didn't have quite as many pitchers that were throwing regular. But I'm going to have a larger data set both from the fall and the spring to see growth numbers and to see normative ranges, and hopefully to allow players a little bit more ability to go, hey, trust the process too. Like, trust the work that you need to do over the long haul and the daily stuff Boy, you alluded to that a ton as well. Like, just there's so many factors here that you have to get aligned. And it's not just going to happen right away.
Yeah. And then the one other thing that I wanted to add is, seeing the velo gain, either, as the season goes on, I wonder how much that just has to do with them now getting in shape, right? And building up the capacity, right? Like that. So sometimes, to your point of like, how much of that is us and how much of that is the fact that like, it's just the game taking care of, it's the exposure. Because I think, the basic element of in practice, if you can get the exposure in practice, now all of a sudden now you're moving that process along. And that's where, again, I do think, okay, a guy has great velocity or whatever, but I've also seen it, guys come in, they have great velocity and then now they're getting injured. So, okay, so now you have this capacity, but you don't have the longevity to be able to sustain it. And I think that comes back again, in my opinion, the whole purpose of training is to prepare you for the thing that you want to do. And so I think right now, a lot of the development is just incomplete. It's getting us to it's opening a door, but it's not preparing you to really walk through the door and have success on the other side of it all the time. And we're leaving it sometimes up to the game, to hoping that the game will take care of that piece. I think this is, something that Tyler kind of talked about, Yerby, when we were at Starters, Tanner, of like, when a lot of times the SNC coaches, and this was the argument to get some more of the skill work into the SNC side, was like, all right, I'm going to do some physical prep for you guys. I'm going to walk you to the bridge. I'm going to pat you on the butt and be like, good luck trying to figure out how to get over this bridge to the other skill side of this. And I think that's where we need to improve.